Thanks, Dr. Burke, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to talk today with my colleague Seán Corrigan about probably a project that's been referenced on the last number of rural water conferences, and that is the National Federation of Group Water Schemes Phase 2 Source Protection Pilot Project. Now look, at myself and Seán are going to split the time, as Dr. Burke was saying. We've 10 minutes each, so I'll only be fit to briefly brush over some of the key works and findings of the report. And it concluded in 2022. It was funded in line with the Rural Water Programme. It ran in conjunction to that, and then the final report on the findings was produced earlier this year. Okay, so just to give a bit of background and context to it, there was 9 group water schemes that were selected and had an integrated catchment plan produced, and that's what we called them at the time. Since then, we've changed the terminology to an integrated source protection plan. There was a 10th on the list, but that's been deferred to a later date, and that will be done under the next tranche of plans that are due to get completed. When selecting it, it was important that we selected a range of group water schemes in terms of their size and their scale, and I suppose the number of domestic connections and their daily usage or abstraction rates probably identifies on the table there that we did capture a range of scales. It was also important that there was a variety of water quality conditions at these schemes, and also give some thought to some potential contaminants that we might run into, and that's why there was a bit of a mix. It was also important, I suppose, to test the whole process, that we had a certain amount of complexity within our catchments. So, for instance, in the groundwater schemes in counties Westmeath and Roscommon, they were largely set in karst environments, whereas in the Sternuden Group Water Scheme, which was the surface water scheme selected for the project, it's a large scheme. And when I mean large, it's large in terms of its water usage, and it's large in terms of its catchment size as well. It would also be a scheme that would be potentially vulnerable to both rural and urban pressures. So we thought it was a good candidate. So to do this, and to keep us on a structured path, we developed a framework for drinking water source protection, and that was done, and it set out a stage process, an 8-step process to try and develop an integrated source protection plan. Now, as I say, we had 9, and whenever we carried this exercise out amongst the schemes, we found that 6 of the 9 would benefit from a water quality improvement. And I'm talking about source water, not water, treated water, not the potable water. So it's trying to get that bit of protection in before we go to the last barrier of the approach. And I suppose it was timely. We know now with the recast Drinking Water Directive that there now is an onus within the catchment to actually risk assess that, and there's a new framework, a new guidance document being developed to coincide with that recently transposed legislation. Just in terms of the actual project, as well as coming up with a catchment characterisation and a conceptualisation of the catchments and an idea of what we would like to do to protect our water, there was a big focus on actually implementing some of them source protection actions. And before I go any further, Thomas Rush, Noel Carroll, Anthony Lee, and then Sternuden Group Water Scheme, I see James McGlone and Paddy Ward and Ross McDonald, who has been the project officer driving it on in Sternuden for the last couple of years. I see them in the audience. Those guys deserve a massive amount of credit for actually getting the measures into the ground, because it can be challenging. And not every door you knock on, you're going to get a yes, but they managed to get more yeses than no's, I suppose. So in relation to what sort of mitigation we were looking at, it was a 2-pronged approach. First and foremost, there was a physical measure put in place to try and see our improvement, and physical measures included, depending on the pressure, it was, simply it could have been livestock prevention from watercourses, where there was a need for, to introduce a new drinking water supply, an alternative source was provided, and then indeed in some areas where there was overland flow paths found to be in critical source areas, there was these things, extended buffer zones put in place. Not very many projects, I suppose, throughout the country would have that in place, but it was achieved across all schemes, and I suppose we call them smart buffers or dynamic buffers, and they really are probably the way forward on that. To quantify, I suppose, the quantity of physical measures that was put in place, you're talking about 20 kilometres of fencing, perhaps 10.5 hectares of that smart buffer, thousands of native trees planted on farmlands, and then approximately 1.7 kilometres of bank revetment works that was done. So that's bank stabilisation works on the water network. or the river network, I should say. Then the second pronged approach, it was the use of communication, I suppose, as a mitigation. Now, I'm not going to delve too much into that. Seán, my colleague, talks more about that and is stronger on it than I am, so I'll leave that to Seán. But one thing just to point out that I suppose physical measures or communication measures, they weren't mutually exclusive to any particular schemes. Each scheme embraced that approach and had success. Indeed, some of the measures the guys did in Stranooden in terms of the bank revetment, the purpose of doing it there was to stop off overland flow paths. It was done then in conjunction with inland fisheries to get a mutual benefit for the freshwater ecological system. But since that now, it actually has merit in doing some of that works in some of our groundwater catchments, whereby Ogla Spring, for example, sinking streams that are hydrologically connected back to the source, that delivers the turbidity to the source. The likes of this bank revetment work has been investigated and indeed has been started there as well. Now, it's encouraging. I talked about measures within the pilot sites itself and measures then that were replicated within other pilot sites, but it is encouraging to see that other group water schemes are now taking up the mantle and producing some of these measures in their own schemes. There's many schemes I could reference here. I'm just going to give an example of one. I see Seamus in the audience there, Crosser Loch Group Water Scheme, and it's a particularly nice example, I think, because in this area it was identified as a critical source area. And the green hatch there on the screen is a representation of what we would call a smart buffer that has been planted up with native woodland. And then there's a payment given back, I suppose, to the farmer there. So that's another benefit. It's positioned there to intercept those overland flow paths that discharge into the drainage channel. If you're following me, then that discharge back into the inflow into the loch, which ultimately offers the protection. And unfortunately, it's probably that level of detail that our integrated source protection plans are going to have to go into if we are going to see an improvement in some of our more impacted schemes. And that's just something to note and something that we're really working hard with on the new ISPPs, and a number of consultants have produced them to date. So I suppose with all that works and measures, has there been any positive results? And we've seen a couple. I suppose there's some green shoots of hope really in that MCPA was a principal contaminant of concern, particularly in Stranooden. And what MCPA is, we all know it's an acid herbicide that kills off rushes. And there was one particular area when we'd done our monitoring in the Stranooden Group Water Scheme that was delivering a disproportionately larger amount of MCPA in comparison with other subcatchments, and that's what we call the Derry Valley subcatchment. And it's identified by label, I think it's WASW 1201 there. So that's subcatchment contributing about 40 kilometres square of area back into the loch. And I suppose in 2020, at the outset of it, we had an annual loading of 1.18 kilos per year of MCPA. But then, with the rollout of a lot of measures, physical, communication, measures like the weed wiping, which kind of crossed both borders, you would say, really, we've seen a reduction then in 2021, with that MCPA loading come out of Derry Valley catchment had almost halved. So that was a nice positive result. Indeed, MCPA, unfortunately, it is a contaminant concern in a lot of our schemes. A number of schemes would see exceedances. Just to borrow back again from Crosser Loch Group Water Scheme, they had an issue in 2020 as well. We can see some of the values on the screen there, exceedances ranging from 0.49 micrograms per litre to 0.83 micrograms per litre, and that's quite high, and it will cause an issue. Whilst it mightn't necessarily be a health impact, it is going to give you a headache, basically, if you get a letter in the post to say that you've got a non-compliance. So that really made the scheme act. They were involved in the integrated resource planning and the next cycle. There was a big commitment from the committee to actually up the onus on source protection. And thankfully, the following year after all that, we've seen a much brighter picture, a greater increase in weeks and months that was clear of MCPA contamination. I know from talking to Alan McCabe, who's now the manager of the Glasslotte Holland Group Water Scheme, they've done works with the Catchment Care project in the River Blackwater, and they had a similar problem in their catchment in 2021. Detailed monitoring was fit to determine where the issues was coming from, worked in the catchment, and the issues didn't repeat themselves the following season, or the following year rather. So that was great. Just in terms of, it's important, okay, so officially the project has ended in 2022, but it's important that it doesn't stop there, because I suppose pressures and issues in a catchment will be ever evolving and will change. I know this morning we talked about how change is positive. Sometimes change in this particular perspective isn't positive, and so it's important that we are constantly looking and monitoring at our results. It was towards the tail end of the project when we figured out that there was one particular I suppose, stream out of 8 streams that are contributing to the Dromore River was delivered in, I think it was over 600 kilos of pea out of the total 1,100 kilos of pea that was coming out of that particular catchment. So that's now where the guys are going to focus their works on over the next couple of years. And from that, Ross, who was involved in the project the last couple of years, has been kept on and is working in a source protection capacity, and has also launched the Friends of the Dromore River Trust out of that catchment as well. I suppose, Geraldine mentioned the importance of monitoring, and it's the very, very same if you have a problem at source. It's one example of what you can do when you have good monitoring, I suppose, is there in Valley Group Water Scheme, who had an ISPP produced. They took the recommendations that were put in their Phase 1 reports from back a number of years ago and carried out the sampling on a monthly basis on a number of tributaries. And from that, we were then fit to apply the methodologies in the Sternuden aspect to determine where maybe the principal areas to work with within a catchment were. And we found that, again, that figure of 50%, which is not a coincidence, it seems to be happening across the board, was being delivered from the headwaters of the Cully. So that is now where the scheme has started to invest some of their own resources in trying to implement measures as well. And just to finish off, I see I'm running out of time. As I say, just when you find it, that's the second last step. The big step then is, what approach do you take to communication, really? And Seán will deal with that very adequately, I'm sure, in the next couple of slides. But this is just an example from Sternuden. One particular instance, we can see the burnt grass along the river. We obviously have a pesticide issue there. But it just took going out, communicating, understand the problem. We can see then the problem was stopped. Thereafter, the year later, there was a want to actually go a bit further. It was fenced off, and now it's going to come full circle again, where there's an understanding of what them actions can do from a co-benefit point of view, as well as just from a water quality perspective. So I'll pass it over to Seán. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thanks, Jolanta. And I think that stretch even kind of sets the tone for what we're trying to do here. This project is about more than science, it's about people. It's about putting a smile on people's faces and getting them to work with us. None of us alone here can do anything, but if we work together and collaborate, we can get the job done. Patrick talked about the framework, the catchment data. All of this is very, very scientific based. So we have a process that we follow to ensure that we get the best practice that we can. So our project is based on science, it's based on collaboration, and it's based on measurable actions. So we have our framework, our catchment data, our plans, and our handbook that we all developed as part of this process. Collaboration was key. We worked with 26 stakeholder groups to get this project over the line. And without the input for them 26 stakeholder groups, we wouldn't have been as successful as we are. All of our actions are risk-based, and they consider the Water Framework Directive, the Drinking Water Directive, and the National Biodiversity Action Plan. And all of our actions have individual benefits with environmental outcomes. And this is really, really important. Every action that we have to place or that we took has to benefit the individuals, but it also has to have an environmental outcome. These are some of our stakeholder groups here, and I refer to the people in the slides as stakeholders. Now, stakeholders isn't a word that I really like to use because it's more about people. If we start to call people stakeholder groups instead of personalizing who we're trying to talk to, it kind of gets away from us. So we had a dual plan. We wanted to have high visibility in the catchment. It had to be inclusive, and the community initiatives had to change the culture. We were only involved in this project for a number of years, but the projects that we've worked on in Sternuden through Ross and James, and in Roscommon through the managers that are down there at the back of the room, the culture has changed within that community, and we know that because we're measuring it. These are people. So when I talk about stakeholder groups, I'm talking about organizations, but when we get onto the ground to meet with farmers, we have to take that, I suppose, the corporate side out of things, and we have to work with the farmers. So our philosophy was the head, the heart, and the hands. Sounds very simplistic, but this is what we had to do. The head, when you're out talking to a farmer, has to make sense of them. We have to go up to the farmer and show them something that's evidence-based. We can't just go up and say, we think there's something happening in your land here. We have to show them what the problem is. The heart, it has to mean something to them. If you look at social media, and one of the things that we got back from the farmers in the beginning was, we're getting pointed at here by social media. Environmentalists are telling us that we're doing everything wrong here. If you come and talk to us like that, we're going to get nothing done. So you have to speak to the farmers with the respect that they deserve. It's their land. We can say all we want to do, but unless they want to make these changes which go above and beyond regulation, it's not going to happen. And the hands, what we found with the farming community is that they wanted to do something. And an action is no good unless an action is carried out. You can have all the nice files you want on your shelves in your room, but unless these actions are carried out and the farmer takes ownership of them, then it's no good to us. So I suppose before we started talking to the farmers as to implement the projects, we went out and spoke to different groups of them. And we found out the things that were, I suppose, annoying them. We found out the barriers to implementation. And the barriers were they wanted ownership on what happened to their land. So we developed a mitigation handbook. There was a knowledge gap there. So with the help of ASAP, Kieran Kenny and Donal in other catchments, we've developed some training programs. They were worried about losses in farm payment and resources, so we went back to our stakeholder group, told them about these concerns, and there's mitigation measures put in place. They didn't like the constant attack on social media, and they wanted social acceptance as well. Like farmers are very proud of their land, like having rushes in your land, having weeds outside your garden, outside your front wall. These are things that weren't socially acceptable, so we had to change the culture within the community. So when we speak into the farmers, we had to listen with empathy. And listening is a really important part of communication that's often overlooked. We need to look at the problem from the farmer's perspective, listen to what they were saying. We need to vocalize their concerns so they knew that we understood. So it's no good to just us understanding them. We had to tell them that we understood what their problems were. And we had to be upfront in addressing those concerns, and the solution had to benefit the farmer. We also had to make things interesting, and this is where things kind of got a little bit left to center. We introduced bees and biodiversity into what we were trying to achieve. Now we know from the National Biodiversity Centre that people have an affinity to bees. We also know from some research that we did in Roscommon that people wanted to reduce their pesticide usage to protect bees more than to protect water. So we had to bring this into our messaging. So if you provide habitats for bees along water courses, if you provide hedgerows, if you change your spraying habits, you're going to protect your water source and you're going to protect your bees. Again, it was telling the story in the way that people wanted to listen to it. Our key messages were clean water is everyone's responsibility. The farmer holds the key to the solution. We wanted to mainstream biodiversity and nature-based solutions into our decision making and link water, biodiversity and climate and acknowledge people. If people do something, we acknowledge them. We did videos, we held open days with radios, we give them plaques. There's a photograph there of some bee hotels, which is originally carried out in Roscommon, but this was taken in Mayo, where the projects that we're doing, they're transferable. We started off an initiative called I've Planted a Tree in My Garden is Pesticide Free, which was meant for 300 students on Noel Carroll's scheme in mid-Roscommon. That program has rolled across to 8,000 people in Roscommon and another 8,500 people across the country. So we have these ready-made projects that people can work towards. Collaboration is key. It's not all about farmers. Jay will tell you a couple of instances that we had there. We had 2 training days on the photographs here, one with Donal Kennedy, one with Kieran Kenny from ASAP. The help that we got in this project from Roscommon County Council on a personal level has been fantastic. But it was the managers on the schemes that really drove things on the ground. And it was the trust that the managers had with their communities that enabled us to go into the community. Engagement was built on trust. We had our team, we had a model farmer, and additional farmers. As I was reminded by Kieran Kenny during the week, we have external influences that we had to look at as well. Agricultural advisors, EIPs, merchants, other farmers, social media. So we had to be just cognizant that we're not the only people that are talking to farmers. The more we engaged, the more the farmer gave us. These were all voluntary processes. But every manager that you speak to, the more you engage to people, the more they gave us. Identifying the model farmer was key for us. It was farmer-led. They decided what they wanted to do, not us. We told them what the problem was. They decided what the solution was. As the project developed, we noticed people were smiling. And it was actually Seán that noticed this. There was people we were shown photographs of people who'd taken part in these initiatives. And you could see the beams, the smiles, you could see on the videos as well, you could see people were there with their families and they were enjoying themselves. And according to the World Health Organization, well-being is defined as a positive state experienced by individuals and societies. And it encompasses the ability of people and communities to enhance their quality of life by contributing positively to society with a sense of meaning and purpose. And it can be influenced by social and economic and environmental conditions. This is why group schemes were set up, to make things better for our communities. So Jolanta mentioned earlier on that we're doing some research. Jolanta is leading it with the Royal College of Surgeons. And the early results are that the bee projects have connected people. They've helped people with their personal growth. They're giving people meaning and purpose, and they're helping the farmers relax. So the science that we use to set up the strategy of developing the ISPPs, we're also developing a strategy now that means that people will do things and be there and continue them on when we're out of the communities. Some of the quotes, I have 3 small quotes left. These are from the farmers who we interviewed when we finished the project. By bringing bees into our gardens, it has had a ripple effect on the whole community because now they know that they can do something at a local level. People are taking ownership. They know that they can do something. Another farmer said, it's like if you turn on the news, you'll hear all about climate change, you'll hear all about biodiversity and about species dying out. And this is somebody else's news. But if you bring things to a local level, like the beehives, the bee hotels, the trees, the schools, it's not the climate that has to change, we have to change too. That's bringing things back to our own garden. People don't feel helpless. The farmers are now getting involved in national issues like pesticides, protecting mortar phosphates. They see it as their role as to protect the environment. And Ger will probably tell you a little bit about that as time goes on. And finally, this is an important lesson for us all. A guy called Tommy Farrell, a great character on Thomas Rush's scheme, but this can go to any of the schemes that have taken part. Thomas Rush, that's the manager over our scheme, he got in touch to see would I be interested in taking part, so I did. So if you don't ask people, they won't get involved, but if you ask people, they will get involved, and I think that's one of the most important lessons that we've taken from the project. Ask people, get involved, you'll enjoy it, they'll enjoy it, it'll raise the profile of your scheme, it'll get more people involved, which is best for your scheme as well. Okay, thanks very much.